The late afternoon sun reflected off the calm blue waters of the pool at Oak Ridge Residences, a quiet apartment complex in Austin, Texas. Adrian Carter, a 34-year-old marketing consultant, stretched out on a lounge chair, finally enjoying a well-earned break. His workload had been brutal over the past few months, and this was his first chance to truly unwind. Dressed in swim trunks and a loose button-down, he sipped on an ice-cold lemonade, the condensation dripping onto the armrest as he flipped through the pages of a novel. The air was warm but comfortable, carrying the faint scent of sunscreen and chlorine. For a while, everything felt peaceful. Then came the footsteps. Adrian glanced up, squinting against the sun. A woman, likely in her mid-50s, with platinum blonde hair styled to perfection and oversized sunglasses that hid half her face, was walking straight toward him. He recognized her from around the complex, always carrying herself with an air of importance. But they had never spoken. At first, he assumed she needed something, maybe directions, maybe help. But the moment she stopped in front of him, her expression erased any thought of goodwill. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and clipped. "Do you live here?" Adrian blinked, taken aback by the bluntness of her question. "Yes, I do," he answered evenly, sitting up a little straighter. The woman folded her arms. "Really? Because I've never seen you before. Are you sure you're not visiting someone?" Adrian felt the weight of her words. He'd been living in this complex for over 2 years, and yet here he was, being treated like a trespasser. He took a slow breath, keeping his voice calm. "I'm sure. Apartment 214. Her lips pressed into a thin line as if his answer wasn't good enough. "If that's true, then you should have your keycard. Let's see it." The demand was jarring. Adrian could feel his chest tighten as he weighed his response. He wasn't about to let a stranger dictate his afternoon. "I'm not obligated to show you anything," he said, his tone steady but firm. "If you have an issue, you're welcome to call management." Her face turned red. "Oh, I will," she snapped, already pulling out her phone. As she stepped aside to make her call, her voice loud enough for half the pool area to hear, Adrian sighed and leaned back into his chair. He wasn't looking for drama, but from the way this was going, it didn't seem like he had a choice. Adrian kept his gaze steady, refusing to let the situation shake him. He had done nothing wrong and he knew it. But as the woman paced a few feet away, speaking into her phone with exaggerated urgency, the tension in the air thickened. "Yes, I'm at the pool, and there's a man here who shouldn't be," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "He claims he lives here, but I've never seen him before. I need security to come down immediately." Adrian exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. He had seen this type of situation unfold before, just never to him. A few other residents lounging by the pool had begun to take notice. Some exchanged glances. A couple on the far side whispered to each other, while an older man in swim trunks shook his head slightly. A few people subtly pulled out their phones, their screens glowing in the fading sunlight. Still, no one intervened. The woman, emboldened by the lack of response, turned back to Adrian. "You could have avoided all this if you'd just shown me your key card," she said, folding her arms like she had just won some kind of battle. Adrian looked at her, expression unreadable. "I don't owe you anything," he replied simply, her face twisted with frustration. "People like you think you can do whatever you want," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for him and the nearest bystanders to hear. His jaw tightened. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what she meant by "people like you," but he refused to give her the reaction she wanted. Instead, he turned back to his book, flipping a page as if her words were nothing more than background noise. Minutes later, the sound of the pool gate clicking open signaled the arrival of a uniformed security guard. He looked young, early 20s at most, with a wary expression as he surveyed the scene. The woman wasted no time. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she said, waving him over. "This man refuses to leave. He claims he lives here, but I'm certain he doesn't. He wouldn't even show me his key card." The guard hesitated, glancing at Adrian, who had already set his book down and risen to his feet. He was a full head taller than both the woman and the guard. "I do live here," Adrian said, his voice even but firm. "Apartment 214. You can check with management if you need to." The guard shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, do you have your key card with you?" Without a word, Adrian reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet and flipped it open. Inside, his keycard rested alongside his driver's license, which clearly displayed his address. He held them up for the guard to inspect. The young man leaned in, then nodded, his face reddening slightly. "That checks out," he said, handing the card back. "Sorry for the trouble, sir." The woman's mouth fell open. "Wait, you're just going to take his word for it?" she demanded. The guard straightened. "Ma'am, he provided the necessary proof. There's nothing else to discuss." A murmur spread through the onlookers. The young couple who had been watching from the other side of the pool exchanged glances, then nodded in quiet approval. The older man shook his head again, this time more openly. But before the situation could dissolve completely, a voice rang out from the other side of the pool. "Enough is enough." Heads turned toward the speaker, a neighbor stepping forward to reveal a history that would change the course of the confrontation entirely. The voice cut through the evening air like a knife, turning all heads toward a woman standing near a shaded lounge chair. She was in her late 60s, dressed in a floral sundress, her silver hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed sun hat. Her posture was upright, confident, like someone who had seen enough and decided it was time to speak. "Excuse me," she said, walking toward the scene with slow, deliberate steps. "But this isn't the first time this has happened, and I think it's about time someone said something." The woman accusing Adrian spun around, her expression shifting from triumph to uncertainty. I I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. "Oh, don't play coy," the older woman shot back, her voice carrying across the pool area. "You've been doing this for months, and we're all tired of it." She turned to the security guard. "Just last week, she accused a delivery driver of loitering because he was eating lunch in his truck. And let's not forget the time she called the cops on those college kids moving into their apartment because they looked suspicious." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered residents. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. The accusing woman's face flushed. "I was just trying to keep the community safe," she snapped. The older woman shook her head. "No, you were making assumptions about people who don't look like you." Her voice softened slightly, but her words still carried weight. "That's not how a community should treat its neighbors." Silence settled over the group. Then from somewhere in the crowd, a single clap. It started slow, hesitant, but within seconds more people joined in. The woman's face paled. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, clutching her purse. But the damage was done. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the pool area. The security guard exhaled, clearly relieved. "Sorry about that, sir," he said to Adrian. "If you ever have any problems, let management know." Adrian nodded but said nothing, because deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Someone had been recording, and the world was about to take notice. By the time the woman disappeared beyond the pool gate, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The murmurs of residents grew louder, a mix of agreement, disbelief, and frustration hanging in the air. But the real shift had come when Eleanor, sharp, composed, and unwilling to let things slide, had spoken up. Adrian turned to her, his expression a mix of gratitude and quiet relief. He hadn't expected anyone to step in, let alone with such conviction. Eleanor, however, wasn't done. She turned back toward the remaining crowd, her voice steady but firm. "I hope everyone here is paying attention," she said, sweeping her gaze across the onlookers. "Because this is not just about tonight. It's about a pattern of treating people differently based on assumptions." The pool area was silent now, no longer just a backdrop to someone else's problem. It was personal. A younger woman near the cabanas hesitated before speaking. I remember when she called security on my boyfriend. He was waiting outside for me, and she accused him of lurking." A man near the pool steps nodded. "Yeah, she reported my teenage son for acting suspicious just because he was walking his dog at night." Eleanor let the weight of their words settle before continuing. "And it's not just her. It's what happens when people assume the worst about someone simply because they don't fit their idea of who belongs here." She looked at Adrian now, her expression softening. This man was sitting here, minding his own business, and yet he had to prove he belonged in his own home. A few heads lowered, others nodded in understanding. Then Eleanor exhaled, letting go of some of her own tension. "We have to be better than this. A pause, then applause. This time it wasn't hesitant or scattered. It was strong, decisive. A show of support, not just for Adrian, but for the idea that their community could and should be different. Eleanor turned back to Adrian. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said, her voice quieter now. "It wasn't right, and it wasn't fair." Adrian gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. But even as the energy of the confrontation started to fade, something lingered in the air, something that wasn't there before. Because in the age of smartphones, moments like this don't stay within the walls of a single community. Someone had been recording, and soon the world was about to see exactly what had happened at Oak Ridge residences. As the crowd at the pool slowly began to disperse, the impact of what had just happened lingered. Conversations continued in hushed voices, some residents shaking their heads, others replaying the moment in their minds. But while the confrontation had ended at Oak Ridge residences, it was only just beginning elsewhere. A few hours later in his apartment, Adrian sat on his couch, still processing the evening's events. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, lighting up with notifications. At first he ignored them, assuming they were just work emails or the usual social media noise. But when he finally reached for his phone, he froze. His name was all over the place. A resident named Lucas had uploaded a video of the entire confrontation to social media with a simple caption: "This just happened at Oak Ridge. When will this stop?" The clip had already gained thousands of views. By the time Adrian clicked on it, the number was climbing fast. The footage showed everything: the woman's accusations, Adrian's calm refusal to comply, Eleanor's fiery speech, and the applause that followed. The comments section exploded with reactions. "This is disgusting. Imagine being harassed at your own home." Adrian handled that like a boss. Calm, collected, and didn't let her bait him. "Eleanor is the real MVP. More people need to speak up like this. This is why we need better conversations about racial profiling. It happens everywhere, all the time." The video wasn't just being shared, it was spreading like wildfire. By morning, major social media pages had reposted it. The hashtags number Oak Ridge incident, number racial profiling, and number community change were trending. Adrian's inbox flooded with messages, friends checking in, co-workers expressing their support, even strangers reaching out to share their own experiences. Some thanked him for his composure, others apologized on behalf of people like Deborah. But not all the responses were positive. There were also messages calling him overly sensitive or accusing him of turning a misunderstanding into a public spectacle. "This was just a mix-up, man. She was just being cautious. People like you are always trying to make everything about race. She was protecting her neighborhood, and now you're trying to ruin her life over it?" Adrian scrolled past the negativity, refusing to let it pull him in. He wasn't surprised. He knew how these conversations played out online. But the reality was, this wasn't about one woman's ignorance. It was about a bigger issue, one that resonated with people far beyond Oak Ridge residences. At the leasing office, property manager Vanessa Delgado was also watching the video. Her expression darkened as she read the comments. She had already received multiple complaints about Deborah in the past, but this was undeniable. There was now video evidence of her behavior, and it had gone far beyond their apartment complex. Vanessa wasted no time. She called a meeting for the following morning, with both Adrian and Deborah. Adrian hesitated when he received the email. He wasn't eager to sit across from her again, to relive the entire thing, but then he thought of everyone who had experienced moments like this and had no proof, no witnesses, no support. He wasn't just going for himself, he was going for them too. Meanwhile, the outside world wasn't waiting for a resolution. News outlets had picked up the story. Blogs, podcasts, and online commentators weighed in, debating the broader implications of racial profiling and accountability. By the time Adrian walked into that meeting the next morning, the video had been seen by millions. The whole world was watching. The next morning, Adrian walked into the leasing office conference room, the weight of the past 24 hours settling on his shoulders. He had barely slept. The viral video had taken on a life of its own, dominating social media feeds, sparking heated discussions, and even making its way onto morning news segments. Across the table sat Deborah. She looked nothing like the self-assured woman who had confronted him by the pool. Her posture was stiff, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her purse. Unlike the previous evening, she avoided eye contact. Vanessa Delgado, the property manager, folded her hands on the table and wasted no time. "I've reviewed the footage," she said, her tone measured but firm. "Deborah, this behavior is unacceptable. We've received multiple complaints about similar incidents. But this time, there's undeniable proof." Deborah's lips tightened. "I was just trying to keep the community safe," she muttered. "How was I supposed to know he lived here?" Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. "Because it's not your job to know. That's why we have security and management. Your actions have created unnecessary conflict and distress, not just for Mr. Carter, but for other residents as well." Deborah opened her mouth to protest, but quickly realized she had no argument. Instead, she crossed her arms, her expression souring. "So what now? You're kicking me out?" Vanessa let a beat of silence pass before replying. "You're receiving an official written warning. Any further incidents like this will result in the termination of your lease." Deborah's face flushed. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, but she didn't argue further. She knew she had no ground to stand on. Vanessa turned to Adrian, her tone softening. "Mr. Carter, I'm truly sorry this happened. If there's anything we can do to support you, please let us know." Adrian nodded. "I appreciate that," he said, though he wasn't sure what support would look like. Nothing could erase what had happened. As Deborah pushed back her chair and stormed out, Adrian felt a strange mix of emotions: vindication, exhaustion, and a lingering sadness that any of this had to happen in the first place. But it wasn't over yet, because outside of Oak Ridge residences, the video was still spreading, and the conversation was only getting louder. By the time Adrian stepped out of the leasing office, the world outside Oak Ridge residences had already taken notice. What had started as a confrontation at the pool had transformed into a national conversation. The video continued to spread across social media, racking up millions of views. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as yet another example of racial profiling in everyday life. Morning talk shows debated the incident, podcasts dissected its implications, and online personalities weighed in with their own takes. Who Belongs trended alongside Chunner racial profiling and Stand Up for Justice. Adrian's inbox was flooded. Messages poured in from strangers sharing their own experiences. Stories of being questioned, harassed, or assumed to be somewhere they didn't belong. Some were from people who had faced profiling firsthand. Others were from allies, thanking him for how he had handled the situation with calm and dignity. Then came the interview requests. Producers from national networks wanted him on their shows. Activists and public figures reached out, offering their platforms to amplify his voice. Even major brands and organizations sent emails, eager to align themselves with the moment. But not all responses were supportive. The backlash had started too. Some people dismissed the entire incident as overblown. "She was just being cautious. What's the big deal? This is how neighborhoods stay safe, and now she's being punished for it? Maybe if he had just shown his key card, none of this would have happened." Adrian had expected this. He had seen it happen before. Every time a story like this went viral, there were people who tried to downplay it, shift the blame, or act as if it was just a misunderstanding. But he knew better. This wasn't just about one nosy neighbor. It was about a pattern, one that repeated itself in different places, in different ways, but always with the same underlying message: you don't belong here. Meanwhile, the fallout for Deborah had been swift and public. Someone from the apartment complex anonymously shared more stories of her behavior, adding fuel to the fire. People dug through old neighborhood forum posts and found more instances where she had made unfounded accusations. Her name began trending alongside Adrian's, though for entirely different reasons. Some people sympathized with her embarrassment, but the overwhelming sentiment was clear: she was in the wrong. As pressure mounted, discussions turned to what accountability should look like. Some called for her eviction. Others suggested mandatory anti-bias training. A few went further, arguing that repeated false accusations should carry legal consequences. At Oak Ridge residences, the ripple effects were undeniable. Residents who had once stayed silent about their experiences now spoke up. Conversations about bias, community and inclusion happened in hallways, at mailboxes, and in the complex's online forums. For the first time, people were acknowledging that Oak Ridge wasn't as welcoming as it seemed, and that things needed to change. Vanessa Delgado, the property manager, took the feedback seriously. She sent out an email to all residents announcing upcoming workshops on unconscious bias in community building. She also set up an anonymous reporting system for complaints about racial profiling, making it clear that incidents like this would not be tolerated. For Adrian, the past few days had been overwhelming, exhausting, and surreal. He never wanted to be in the spotlight. He had simply wanted to relax by the pool. But now his face and name were everywhere, attached to something bigger than himself, and he couldn't ignore it. So when a well-known talk show invited him to speak about his experience, he took a deep breath, thought about all the people who had reached out, and responded with a single word: yes. In the days following Adrian's interview, the atmosphere at Oak Ridge Residences felt different. The poolside confrontation had been a spark, but the fire it ignited burned far beyond a single viral moment. Conversations that had once been whispered in private were now happening openly. In the hallways, in the mailroom, on the apartment complex's community forum. People who had never spoken to Adrian before now stopped him to say, "I saw the video. I'm sorry that happened." Some admitted that they had experienced similar encounters but had never spoken up, fearing they wouldn't be believed or that nothing would change. But now something was changing. Vanessa Delgado followed through on her promise. She sent out an email announcing a series of community meetings on inclusivity and unconscious bias. The first session was packed. More residents showed up than she had expected. Some came out of curiosity, others because they felt guilty for having stayed silent when Deborah confronted Adrian. A few, like Eleanor, attended because they knew this was a conversation that had been a long time coming. At that first meeting, a man named James spoke up. "My teenage son walks our dog every night, and I always tell him to keep his hands out of his pockets, to never wear his hoodie up, to make sure he looks non-threatening. That's just reality for us," he said, shaking his head. "But it shouldn't be." Heads nodded around the room. A young woman named Maria shared her experience. "I used to babysit for a family here, and one time a resident called security on me because I was lingering outside the lobby. I was waiting for the parents to let me in." She let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I was 17. More stories followed. Residents who had never spoken about these moments now felt safe enough to do so. The tension that had once lingered beneath the surface was finally being acknowledged, and acknowledgement was the first step toward change. Outside of Oak Ridge, the conversation kept growing. Adrian's interview resonated with millions, reinforcing what many already knew. Racial profiling wasn't just a headline, it was an everyday reality for too many people. His words weren't about anger or revenge. They were about accountability, about how communities could do better. And in his own small way, he was starting to see that change firsthand. People in the complex had stopped looking at each other like strangers. The subtle wariness that once defined so many interactions had begun to fade. Neighbors actually greeted each other in the hallways. Kids played more freely in the courtyard without parents anxiously watching every move. The walls of suspicion, built over years of assumptions and quiet biases, were starting to crumble, brick by brick. A few weeks after the confrontation at the pool, Adrian stood at the grill, flipping burgers as the smell of sizzling meat filled the air. Music played softly from a nearby speaker, blending with the sound of laughter and conversation. The Oak Ridge Residences community barbecue was in full swing. It had started as a simple idea. Eleanor had suggested it over coffee one morning. "We need to stop just talking about community and actually start acting like one," she had said. Adrian agreed. And so, with the help of Vanessa and a few other residents, they put together a gathering open to everyone in the complex. No agendas, no speeches, just food, music, and a chance to connect. At first, he had been unsure of how many people would show up. But as he looked around now, the turnout was better than he had imagined. Families brought homemade dishes, kids chased each other around the courtyard, and neighbors who had once only exchanged polite nods were now deep in conversation. Across the lawn, he spotted Eleanor sitting in a shaded corner, chatting with a group of younger residents. Every so often, her laughter rang out above the chatter, warm and unapologetic. Adrian had lost count of how many people had approached him that evening, not just to talk about the video, but to share their own experiences, to thank him, to ask what more they could do. The barbecue wasn't about the past. It was about moving forward. Near the drinks table, Vanessa stood talking with James, the father who had spoken at the first community meeting. His son stood next to him, plate in hand, looking far more at ease than Adrian had ever seen him. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Toward the end of the night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor approached Adrian with a plate of cookies wrapped in foil. "You've done something really special here," she said, handing them to him. Adrian smiled as he accepted them. "I couldn't have done it without you. You were the first one to speak up." She waved him off with a chuckle. "Somebody had to. But you turned it into something bigger, something meaningful." Adrian looked around one more time, taking it all in. The barbecue, the conversations, the people who now saw each other as more than just residents sharing a building. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to be done, still conversations to be had. But it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, Oak Ridge residences actually felt like home. As the last guest trickled out of the barbecue, Adrian found himself lingering on the patio, watching the glow of string lights flicker in the evening breeze. The energy from the gathering still hung in the air, a warmth that hadn't been there before. He thought back to that day at the pool. It had started as an ordinary afternoon, just him, a book, and the quiet hum of the water. And then, in an instant, everything had changed. What was meant to be a moment of peace had turned into something far bigger, a confrontation, a viral video, a national conversation. And yet, standing here now, he realized something. That moment, as frustrating and exhausting as it had been, had led to this: real change. Not just at Oak Ridge residences, but beyond its gates. The video had long since stopped trending, replaced by the next big story. But its impact lingered. People continued reaching out, sharing their own experiences, asking what they could do. The community workshops Vanessa had set up were still happening, and more people showed up each time. Even small things had shifted. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now exchanged greetings in the hallways. The tension that had once hovered beneath the surface had started to fade, replaced by something lighter, something better. And as for Deborah, she hadn't been evicted, but her presence in the complex had changed. She kept to herself now, avoiding common areas, walking briskly past neighbors without a word. There were rumors that she was considering moving, but nothing had been confirmed. Whether or not she had learned anything was a question only time could answer. For Adrian, though, the lesson was clear. This wasn't just about calling out bad behavior. It was about creating spaces where people felt like they belonged, where no one had to prove they had a right to exist. During his interview, the host had asked him what he wanted people to take away from his story. He had taken a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. "It's not just about confrontation," he had said. "It's about building bridges, about changing the way we see each other. Small actions lead to big changes, but it all starts with the courage to say, 'This isn't right.'" That clip had gone viral too, sparking another wave of conversations. Now, as Adrian stood on his patio, watching the last of his neighbors head inside, he allowed himself to exhale. The work wasn't done. It never would be. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, things felt different, and that was enough, for now.